the scariest thing in the world. I got the cab to pull up 100 yards short and paid the guy in cash, adding a generous tip, despite having been told multiple times that people didn't do that here in Finland. A few euros here or there make little difference to me, but they might to the driver. I worked as a waiter for a couple of years back in the day. What goes around comes around. Halloween party? No, I said. Well, sure, tonight's the night, I guess, but this is part of the Festival of the Fantastique. Ah, yes, I heard of this. Hard not to. European cities tend to care a lot more openly about the arts. The center of Helsinki was festooned with banners for this celebration of the Gothic and weird in prose, film, and art, with big posters at most of the bus stops and on the trams, too. The venue for Greg's event was an imposing neoclassical stone frontage that looked like a museum or embassy or church, strikingly uplit on either side of a large central doorway. I'd asked to be dropped down the street to have a private moment for a cigarette, also to see how the land lay. The line snaked 50 feet down the cold, dark street. Big crowd, huh? Looks like it, I said. I climbed out, rubbing my coat around as a chill wind came whipping down the road, used half of my grasp of the Finnish language in one sentence. Kiitos. After the cab pulled away, I blinked, stretched my mouth and eyes wide, and lit my cigarette. I noticed, pretty drunk. That's unusual for me now, especially at a festival, though in the early days it was near mandatory. We'd arrive in a chaotic flock, get our work hung or installation set up as quickly as possible, and immediately head en masse for the nearest dive bar to talk artsy bullshit, get flamboyantly wasted into the small hours. Repeat for however many nights the event lasted, ending with a wretched train ride home. But I don't go to festivals by train anymore, or doze my hungover way home in the back of some guy's truck, buffeted by unsold prints and paintings. I fly. Actually, I'm flown. If I find myself in a bar at an invite-only party, I arrive escorted by the organizer and their assistant, the PR, sometimes a gallery owner. I'm deferentially handed a glass of obligatory champagne and sip it while chatting with whoever's allowed through the cordon. I'll have a glass of wine during dinner, 2 at most, before switching to espresso and water. Being drunk in public is fine for enfants terribles, not for me. Instead, I'll retire to my hotel room, catch up on email, stand a while looking out the window at whatever city it happens to be, and go to bed. Tonight, the party hadn't been at a public venue, but as sometimes happens, the home of a notable collector of my art. And that's where the trouble started. I dropped a cigarette butt in the trash and headed across the street. Something of a frisson ran through the line as I walked toward the entrance. Half the crowd was in Halloween costume, thankfully all horror-related, instead of the ballerinas and baseball players and other random crap you'll see at home. I considered democratically joining the end of the line, but only for about a second. That just doesn't work. People leave their positions to come say hi. The whole system goes by shit, and it's hassle the organizers don't need when they're trying to get an event started in a timely manner. The festival secretary was at the front, standing with the people checking tickets. Her eyes widened as I approached. Not 3 hours previously, I told her I wasn't coming to the event. Mr. Williams, she said, you've gotten into the spirit of the night in a low-key way, upspraying her hair like the bride of Frankenstein, completing the effect with curved brows and beasting lipstick. What a pleasure to see you here. Figured I'd come support an old friend. Aha, she said. And did you announce you might be attending on the social media? I may have mentioned it. She smiled and looked at the people snaking away down the sidewalk. So that explains this. No, I said. It's been a while since he had a show. I'm sure there's a lot of interest in what Greg's come up with. She winked as if we both knew that wasn't true. Still, no costume for you. I am what I am. That's scary enough. I held up my hands like claws and made a deliberately lame growling sound. She laughed, and her face turned a little more serious. I should warn you, she said. Your friend. He's in a strange mood, I think. Probably nervous. It's a big crowd. She nodded as if reassured. I'm sure that's all it is. The ticket collector stood aside to let me pass, and the people at the front of the line nodded and grinned at me. That's the weirdest thing. Aspect I still haven't gotten used to. I mean, sure, I'm recognizable, somewhat. The TV show did that, along with being laughably characterized as the Anthony Bourdain of art, and simple self-marketing tricks like always wearing a charcoal suit. But why does that mean I get to jump the line? I don't get it. For a moment I considered stopping, briefly joining the front of the line as a gesture of solidarity with the masses, then realized I was being a bit drunk, and in reality I needed both a piss and some more to drink. I didn't want to wait for either, so I swanned in as God intended. A short, dark corridor led to a large circular room with a domed ceiling. This was crowded with a couple hundred people, chattering and milling about and waiting for the event to start. I wrongly assumed the gents would be at the far end of the room. Found myself heading down some stone stairs into a sepulchral space beneath the building, like a crypt made of corridors. There were big bundles of straw and rolls of cotton wool piled up against the walls throughout, large barriers of corrugated cardboard painted black. Sound baffles, presumably, but nowhere to piss. I went back upstairs and found that John. As I came out, a festival underling spotted me and hectically led me to one side. She was shy, her English rather more heavily accented than most of the Finns I'd encountered so far, so it took me a moment to understand where she was taking me. But then, there he was. Rather more overweight than his picture in the festival program suggested, significantly more balding, standing by himself in a cordoned-off area and holding a bottle of champagne bullishly by the neck. "Danny boy," he said, "as I live and breathe." "Greg," I said, "looking good." "That's horse shit and you know it. You, of course, look exactly how you do on the TV. Guess that's what a shit ton of money will do for you." That, and going to the gym and watching what I eat, I thought, making the effort to do all the other tiresome things required not to look like crap at our age. Didn't say it. "You gonna give me some of that drink?" "Oh, yeah." He peered around, eventually spotting the clearly visible array of glasses on the table behind him, slopped a random amount of champagne more or less into one of them. "There are a couple festival people here." I said something borderline rude to that organizer woman, and they all kind of drifted off. "Rude about what?" "You, to be frank." I laughed. "What did you say?" "Just that I didn't think you were all you were cracked up to be. Of course, at that point I had no idea you'd actually be turning up. Look at him." He gestured out at the crowds milling around the room, more than a few of whom were sneaking glances over at us. "Isn't that freaking weird? Them wanting to look at you like that. Or are you used to it by now?" "Doesn't bother me," I said, giving a little wave to a couple of people who seemed familiar. They looked delighted and waved back. Having been recognized by their lord, the peasants rejoiced. "Piss off, Greg. Why are you even here?" "Dude," I said, "it's been a long time, but back in the day, I'd say we were friends, wouldn't you?" "Sure," he said. "I didn't mean that. I meant at this festival. It's all horror stuff. They can call it gothic or fantastique or whatever they like, but that's what it is. Horror movies, horror books, horror art, the genre slum. You haven't done anything like that in frickin' decades." "My Dark Side series 2 years ago." "Oh, screw you. Putting in more shadows and ladling on the burnt umber does not make you a master of the macabre." "I'm flattered you've been keeping up with my work." "Can't frickin' avoid it." "Any idea what I've been doing?" "To be honest, no. Not since." I left it there. He looked away, then back. It was the first time in the entire exchange we'd had direct eye contact. He looked drunk, also tired and hurt. "Installations." "Well, yeah, I know that, which is what the thing tonight is, right? That's great. I always said that was your best medium in the early days." "Are you taking the piss? These still are the early days for me, Danny. I'm literally back where I fucking started." "Careers can be like that. Not yours. Look, what do you want me to say? I've been lucky. And you sold out. That's unfair." "Is it? The annoying thing, the thing that really pisses me off, is you were good. You painted stuff that unnerved the crap out of people. Then you figured out there was no money in it, and so you jumped into the abstractor sphere. We all make choices. Meaning." I shook my head. He knew I was referring to his defining moment. The point where, resentful at not receiving the recognition that in all honesty he probably deserved, he spiraled off into using a genuinely remarkable level of technical skill to start forging art instead of creating it. Of course, faking is an act of creation, of a kind, not least in the level of attention to detail required to convincingly replicate the techniques of others, especially old masters. But it's a road to nowhere good, especially if you have an ego as big as Greg's. They say many serial killers get to the point where they basically want to be caught, either to be put out of their misery, or more likely, finally get the attention they've always craved. It's the same with forgers. Almost none of them are in it for the money. They want to get one over on the gallery owners and collectors and other so-called experts who turn some artists into rock stars and consign others to obscurity. For a while, it's enough for you alone to know you're doing this. Not for long, though. Consciously or otherwise, eventually you'll leave a clue. Greg tried to pull the same trick twice, painting a semi-obvious forgery on top of a much better one, then getting the latter accepted as real, and was caught, and vilified. "Screw you," Greg said. He said it very clearly. Several people outside the cordon heard him and quickly looked away. "Thanks. I was the sole person from the old days who stood up for you. Literally, the only one. And that's why fuck you. It was that which pushed me over the frickin' edge. How do you think it felt? Charity from somebody who gets his assistants to do all the work." "Yeah, I've heard that rumor," I said, knocking back the glass of wine. "It isn't true. Everything with my name on it is mine. I work long hours. I work hard." With your eyes closed? I was saved from having to answer this by the approach of the festival secretary. She'd been hovering in the background for a few minutes. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said. "I just wanted to remind you it's due to start in 20 minutes. "I know," Greg said. "I can tell the frickin' time." "Thank you," I told her. She backed away. "That's why there's a crowd here tonight, isn't it?" Greg said to me angrily. "You fucking tweeted it, didn't you? You couldn't even let me have that." "Shit's sake, I'm going outside for a cigarette." "You still smoke?" I'm genuinely amazed. "We all have a dark side, Greg. I just hide mine, whereas you get yours out like your cock and wave it around. At least I'm honest." "Maybe. The problem is that everybody's already seen your dick and you got nothing left to shock them with." There was still a line at the door, though shorter. It was getting close to showtime. I walked quickly past with my head down and went far enough up the street that I could stand in a doorway without being seen. Not that I give a damn about people knowing I smoke. I'm 52. My parents are dead. My wife is now an ex-wife. There's not really anybody's judgment that I have to take seriously. Except my own, of course. I stood huddled in shadow and sucked down the first cigarette quickly, deciding to have another on the grounds I had no idea how long this event was going to take. The description merely said it was something everybody experienced together, rather than wandered through in their own time. Seeing Greg had affected me in ways I hadn't anticipated, too. Most of my reason for being here was generally to show support. But sure, I'll admit a portion of it was to present myself to him, to the guy who had always had so much more flair in the old days, always attracted the lion's share of attention, who had no qualms about elbowing friends aside in order to get to the reviewer, gallery owner, or girl. The alpha creator, the hare who burned out and let the beta male tortoise overtake in the long run. Being in the same physical space for the first time in probably 20 years, however, caused that to fall away. Instead, it reminded me of the days when you hung with people because of a spark, not because of their status. And you created things not because they'd be good investments, because they touched people, because what you did was real. As I was lighting the second cigarette, I realized someone was approaching. My heart sunk. The glass of champagne I'd thrown back had taught me up to pretty drunk level. Didn't want to undergo a stilted conversation with a fan. "Can I bum one of those?" It was Greg. I held out the pack. He took one and accepted a light. Stood for a moment looking along the dark street, shook his head. "Sorry I was such a cunt." "I enjoyed it. Reminded me of the old days." He laughed. "You win that one." "Well, I'm a winner to the bone." This had been a catchphrase of Greg's 30 years ago. He remembered. Yeah, screw you. Look, seriously, though, this is important. Why are you actually here? What difference does it make? I wasn't kidding earlier. During that whole dumpster fire 4 years back, after I was dumb enough to try to sell a fake to a celebrity, wound up being the poster boy for pricks everywhere, it was you coming to my defense that pushed me over the edge. I spent the next 3 years going raging drunk. I started to speak, but he rode over me. I know. I'm sure you did it with good intentions, because you've always been a good boy. But that's what happened. My shit is closer to being back together now. So I just want you to know how much... I just want to know how much charity is involved here." "Not at all," I said. "If you want to know, it's this. Punching a hole. Remember that?" He did. The act of recollection made him look younger for a moment. Of course. What I used to say we were going to do. Or should do. Not just put rectangular shit on people's walls. Make things that changed the world. Things that would be remembered forever. "Right. Did you bring the champagne out with you?" "The Finns are open-minded, but not that open-minded," he said. "However," he pulled a small flask out of his coat. I unscrewed it and took a long pull. "I don't get what you're saying." Well, I was at dinner this evening, I said. The vodka felt good and warm inside me. Did what ill-advised drinks always do, which is make you want to have a dozen more. At the home of the biggest collector of my work in Finland, whole of Europe in fact, roasted boar, appetizers with 7 different types of smoked fish, champagne that was older than the pert little things who were serving it. I went to McDonald's. Whatever, Greg, just listen. The festival committee was there. A couple super fans, the freaking mayor, and this collector and her husband, of course. Before the food is served, we were all led with great ceremony to a separate wing they'd had built to showcase their art. One room of which, the main room, the reason the wing was built, was specifically for me. I hadn't realized how much of my stuff she had. It was like seeing my entire life nailed to the walls. And there, at the end of this gallery, is a huge space dedicated to a single painting from my Dark Side series. It's very big. There's nearly a bucket of burnt umber on that one alone. Spotlit, in full glory, probably the best thing I've ever done. And the hostess stands there and regales everybody with how, in the 9 months since the wing was built, she's made sure every guest comes and sees this work of mine, how they all tell her how marvelous it is. And she raised her glass to me, and then to the painting, and the assembled company spontaneously broke into applause. Greg was looking down at the sidewalk now. I knew how he'd be feeling, and also that we were running out of time. "So what's your point?" he muttered. "It had been hung sideways," I said. As we walked back to the building, I saw the festival organizer waiting in the doorway. She looked relieved to see us. "Everybody's downstairs," she said, "waiting. It's amazing. There's over 300 people." "Cool," Greg said. "Let them get settled. 5 minutes. You not going down?" She shook her head apologetically. "I don't like the dark." I followed Greg into the big ante-chamber room, which was now empty. "So what is this thing of yours, anyway?" "Borderline plagiarism," Greg said, looking slightly embarrassed, "which is why you were in my mind and probably why I dissed you to that woman earlier, if I'm honest. Actually, I'm pretty sure we talked it into shape together some long, drunken night of yesteryear. But the initial idea was yours." "Idea for what?" "The scariest thing in the world." For a second, I had no idea what he was talking about. Then I remembered. "Christ," I said. He rolled his eyes. "I know, right? The years go by." I nodded, though he'd misunderstood. I hadn't meant how long it was since we talked about a psychological horror installation, though yes, it had been a quarter of a century. I meant how dumb and sad it was to go ahead and actually do it. It had seemed grown up and cool back then, before we were real adults. Get people down into a confined space. Turn off the lights. Deaden the sound. Close the door so that nobody could find their way out, and make them stay there for half an hour. The idea being to demonstrate that it wasn't horror or the fantastical that was truly frightening. Those were merely entertainments, distractions, safe spaces for our anxieties. And the real and oldest horror, the scariest thing in the world, is being alone in the dark. Very big, right? Very deep. Back then. Now it felt woefully simplistic and juvenile, cool and edgy only before you'd had to deal with grown-up stuff, like the lingering death of parents, or marriages exploding into bloody shards, before you'd learned that the deepest pit is not the dark, but our own fears and doubts, regrets and wrong paths and mistakes, before you found yourself looking around in panic, not understanding where you are or how you got there, or in which direction, if any, a meaningful future lies. All Hallows Eve is supposed to be when the walls of reality come down, the dark spirits walk abroad and knock on doors. The truth is, they're already inside. The idea we'd once nurtured was adolescent and naive. I knew that when people left the venue tonight, Greg's career would be over forever. "Well, good luck," I said, however. "The funny thing is, I remember the idea being yours anyhow." He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, or anybody's probably. Only someone pretty close to the very end of their tether lets emotion like that out the back of their mind far enough to show in their eyes. Bitter gratitude, mangled with utter desperation. "Your stuff's okay," he said. "You know that. I know you didn't actually sell out." "You don't think?" "No. You just choked." He said this with offhand authority, and for a moment I was back to being the 23-year-old I was when I first met Greg. A couple years older than me, far more assured, better connected, part of the scene, already making waves, confident he was going to carve his mark on the world. "Of all of us," he said, "you were the one who could have punched a hole. I knew it then. Which is why I was kind of an asshole to you at times." He shrugged. "Oh well, that ship sailed, I guess. Too late for any of us now. Life goes on." For better or worse. He smiled genuinely and gestured with his head. Show time. I followed him to the big door in the corner of the room and started down the stairs after him into the lower area. Basement, crypt, whatever it was. All the lights down there had been turned off. There was a distant rustle of all the people wandering around the corridors in the pitch dark, waiting for this thing to start, not yet knowing what it was. The sound was soft, deadened, dead. Before we were even at the bottom of the stairs, I realized Greg wasn't as dumb as I'd thought. This felt like going somewhere unsafe. This was a place where, like everybody else, I'd be forced to look inside, to think about a world in which I'd stuck with what I'd been doing, turned out to be the same kind of genuinely interesting footnote to history Greg was, possibly even remained his friend. Where I'd parlayed the TV show into one on a bigger network, maybe even taken up one of the several offers to direct a movie, instead of listening to the quiet inner voices that told me I'd screw it up. Where I'd had the courage to turn down endless commissions, instead spent sufficient time on the woman I loved, giving her enough attention to still have her, instead of losing her to a broken heart. But I didn't. I choked every time. I got to the edge but couldn't make myself jump over. Couldn't take the risk of stretching my soul until it broke. Instead, failed my way into something that only looked like success from the outside. The scariest thing in the world is the widening gap between who you are and who you want it to be. The truth was that Greg wasn't the only faker here tonight. That was a fact worth learning. Didn't have to spend half an hour having it hammered home. I gotta take a piss, I said. I'll be right back. Sure, Greg said, face blank. Close the door on the way out. Keep having a great life. He walked away into the darkness, dismissing me. He knew I wasn't coming back. I hesitated. Maybe it would be good for me to confront myself, to stumble those interior corridors for a while, trying to find a way out. But I didn't want to. I turned and walked back up the stairs. The festival organizer was standing outside on the street. She looked around quickly when I came out of the building, caught in the act of having a cigarette break. Your secret's safe with me, I said. Surprised and sided by the up-ladder by the door, she actually did look kind of like Elsa Lanchester, or close enough. She smiled gratefully. You're not staying? It's been a long day. I don't want there to be any distractions after the show. It's going to be a big success. I want to make sure Greg gets all the credit. He's going to get what he always wanted. And what was that? I just smiled and walked away. After a few minutes, I found a cab and got in and sat in the back, not listening as the chatty driver took me to the Hilton through dark, wet streets. Back to another hotel, and yet another city, back to my great life. I was glad I'd not stayed for the show. Instead of following the path of least resistance, I'd made a decision and done something. I was glad that I for once had not choked. I felt fine about the fact that before securely closing the heavy door to the basement, I held my lighter down to the nearest bundle of straw, waited until it caught alight, then watched as the flames started to spread.